how do we move the needle to allow people to think and understand that skeletal muscle is an organ system that we must care for?
I just spoke to Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who I'm sure
I love Gabrielle.
Yeah.
I just talked to her yesterday.
Yeah, because you are like the tip of the spear, and I think she's like right in your wake, following a lot of the same messaging around protein and muscle-centric medicine. And I see you guys as like leading this new movement around how women are thinking about, going into the second half of life. It's so fantastic.
Right. Remember too, not only is muscle a sugar sponge, and, we call this a metabolic sink. And I always say sugar sponge because I think people will get that visual of like, you're just sucking that sugar in. But the other cool thing that it's an endocrine organ. It's a hormonal organ that is the first line of defense in prediabetes and diabetes. It is the first place that you can start to become more insulin sensitive. And here's what's super cool. Let's say that you did, oopsies, or maybe it's your birthday and you want to have a piece of birthday cake. So I always think, we cannot get so crazy about diets that it's, we're like not living. So it's your birthday. You're going to have a little gluten-free birthday cake and you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor and you're starting to see your glucose go up. Just go do some air squats and some push-ups. Right? Boom. Now You're going to make that the sugar sponge is activated, but you'll also, because you're more insulin sensitive, you're going to just see that curve. Like you'll have that nice response where blood sugar should come up, 20 to 40 points. It's not spiking. It's coming back down again. You never have that because your body knows how to handle it because you've got your muscle working well.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. My readings on my CGM app used to look like the Alps or the Andes. And now, like I said, they're more rolling hills, which is where they should be. And a lot of that had to do with hypertrophy, honestly. And I think it's interesting, the points that you're making around muscle as an endocrine organ, because more and more we're understanding now that there's like a secretome or like essentially hormones and other molecules that are being secreted by muscles that have all sorts of impact around insulin sensitivity, but also around cognitive health, right?
Mm-hmm. I know if you start to look at aging, and I'll tell you this, I loved exercise when I was a little kid, and I always loved exercise and nutrition, and I started teaching calisthenics in high school, and then I went off to college and I started teaching aerobics. And then someone wanted me to come teach aerobics at their house. So I started personal training. As far as I can tell, there was me, Mark Sisson, and Body by Jake. And so I thought, well, I better learn more about this. And I'd run out of classes at UCLA. So I started in biomechanics at Cal State Northridge. Then I went to University of Miami in sports medicine. Then I went over to USC in a PhD in exercise phys, nutrition, and aging. And I was obsessed with, I like exercise. And I felt like kind of the peasant in the health world. Like people didn't recognize exercise as medicine. They really felt like everything was about cardio. By the way, in my grad work, I was the rogue student that did mine on how to develop strength for lifting biomechanics, right? And I had to find someone that would sponsor this work because everyone wanted you to do cardio. Everything was cardio, cardio, cardio. And in fact, they even said, do not lift weights until you lose the weight. I mean, what bad information, what terrible information to, when you have an insulin resistant person who you could quickly help restore insulin sensitivity to, and you're told them not to do that, to just go do, tons of cardio. Terrible. Anyway, why was I telling you all this, Jeff? So I, at the time, I actually dropped out of that PhD program to go into another program in nutrition because I felt like exercise didn't really matter that much because all the stuff was around nutrition. And even back then, we weren't even talking about exercise and hormones, which is crazy now. I didn't start studying that till I was working with a doctor who was starting to look at exercise and cortisol and exercise and insulin. But I feel like now everything's kind of turned around again, and we're really recognizing exercise as the powerhouse it is. Like if you look at all the hallmarks of aging, and you had to pick one tool, you could only have one tool to impact them, exercise would be it, hands down. And within exercise, if you could only pick one tool within exercise, I would argue that resistance training would be the best tool, because it will still improve your VO2 max, right? It will improve that fast twitch muscle fiber, which is the key thing we lose as we age. And, it's going to improve bone density. It's going to improve insulin sensitivity. It's going to improve immune function. It's going to improve BDNF. It's going to improve brain function. It's going to improve your mood, like everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you think about it evolutionarily, what did we do as ancient Homo sapiens for hundreds of thousands of years? We walked. So like zone 2, right? And we lifted things,
right?
And moved things. So we have, developed these adaptive mechanisms in relation to our environment. So that's kind of sometimes what I go back to when I have questions about like, well, what are the things that I should be doing? I actually kind of look back into, who I call Fedge Onsark, which is just my name spelled backwards, but he's my, distant.
Oh, that's very funny.
My
distant. It's interesting.
Yeah.
There's a gal, Dr. Stacy Sims. She's a great researcher, exercise physiologist, who looks at, it really is deep in the science for women. And I had the opportunity to learn from Dr. Lauren Cordain. Like the first time I heard him speak, there were 12 of us, I think, in the room. And I mean, how do you not go crazy listening to this stuff? It's so fascinating. And I thought at the time, women really would have walked, and we would have gathered, and then we would have had to lift things. Yes.
Yeah.
But men were doing more of the zone 2-y type of stuff. And it was interesting because Stacy just pointed out that women do better with HIIT, resistance training, and the long, slow distance stuff, and where men seem to need more of the zone 2. But I look back and I go, how often, you had the messenger that had to run all that way. Well, they weren't a woman. They were a guy. That guy was zone 2ing all that way, not the woman.
Yeah, fair. That's true. That's actually a very good point. Well, let's hover over muscle just for one more second, and then we can kind of go into like what are the techniques for developing more muscle, and we can get into some nutrition. But you talk also quite a bit about core metabolic rate and its relationship to hypertrophy. Can you kind of untangle that for people a little bit of like, why does muscle mass development impact metabolic rate?
Well, so let's first look at what is metabolic rate. And how can you really know what your metabolic rate is? And there's kind of two ways to do this. First thing is, so your metabolic rate is your basal metabolic rate. That's your, I'm sitting here doing nothing. How many calories would I need at rest? Now you can do that doing a breath test. They will predict it from something like a DEXA, but I can tell you doing a DEXA and then doing a breath test, mine was about 100 calories off. But then you've got your daily energy expenditure, and it's really your total daily energy expenditure. That is that basal metabolic rate plus the thermic effect of food. This gets really interesting, by the way, the thermic effect of food, plus activity, with activity being two different things. You've got your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that's not exercise, and exercise. Now, I would argue, for me, I believe exercise, and someone actually like blasted me on, I mean, I guess you can get blasted on social for like breathing, so it's no surprise. But, for me, unless you're deconditioned, walking isn't exercise, because the definition of exercise to me is doing more than what your body is used to, so it has to adapt and get stronger. Mm-hmm. So if you are completely sedentary and walking upstairs or getting out of the chair are a chore, well, then you could get in and out of the chair 10 times. You could walk up the stairs. You could go walking. That would be exercising for a while, but then it wouldn't be, right? You'd get to the point where that's activity. What's interesting about all of this is, your basal metabolic rate is based on your age, your sex, your genetics, your thyroid function, and your body composition. If you have more muscle, you will have a better metabolic rate. Now, it's not, we used to think it was like hundreds of calories for each pound of muscle. I haven't seen anything conclusive about exactly how much it is. It looks like it's maybe 10 to 30 calories a day for each pound of muscle, which doesn't sound like much, but it matters. Like if you look at the Biggest Losers, when they showed that, after the fact, they went back and they gained at least half their weight back because they had created metabolic adaptation, which means their basal metabolic rate was lower than it should have been. It was by 500 calories, meaning we had that basal metabolic rate that we should have based on age, sex, genetics. The modifiable factor there is weight, because if your weight is higher fat, lower muscle, you will have a lower basal metabolic rate. It is why it is so mission critical if we want to lose weight, we actually really want to lose fat, hold on to or build muscle. And the average diet, whether it's semaglutide induced or not, by the way, and all that stuff about diet drugs, I'm like, but that's any diet. Any diet not well constructed will cause you to lose 25 to 35% of those calories from fat-free mass. And if you've got more overall mass to lose, you can afford to lose some of that. You're really looking at holding on to quality muscle. You want to become a filet, not be a ribeye, right? Sure. So that's the first part of your metabolic rate is you've got basal metabolic rate, and then you've got thermic effect of food. And thermic effect of food, how can you modify that? Well, if you simply pulled some of the calories from fat and carbs you use about 5% of the carbohydrates to expend in the metabolism of the carbs. Fat, it's negligible, it's under 1%. Protein, it's about 25%. So if all you did was take some of the calories from your fuel macros of fat or carbs and move them over to protein and change nothing else, assuming that you're isocaloric and eating what you needed to maintain your weight, if you did that, you'd actually lose weight initially because you created a caloric deficit purely by doing that, which is wild. Next piece of it is you've got this activity, which is either that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and you've got exercise. Here's the reality. We need to do exercise to improve our VO2 max, to improve our muscle quality, right? We need to do exercise for those things. And that might be 20 minutes a day, might be 40 minutes a day, but we need to move more, a lot more. And so don't think that you can go exercise 30 minutes a day, sit on your butt 23 hours and 30 minutes a day and be cool. And it is where we really have to have a baseline that we track of 8. And this is what now all the research has said, because there was all this hoopla about the 10,000 steps because it was that thing created by the Japanese company selling pedometers. But it turns out they were fairly close. Like if you look at the bell-shaped curve of how it impacts your health, it's somewhere in the 8 to 12,000 steps. It's kind of like that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your activity buck. And I think it's just one of those things now that we have so many great wearables that can track to tell us if we're doing that we just need to be doing that so that we do park farther away. We do use I've got a treadmill right next to me and a standing desk so that I can use that. For me, I have my office upstairs, and I was so tempted when I built this office to create a little area where I'd have a fridge and my espresso maker. And I thought, no, you're not either. You have to walk down and come back up and walk down. Don't be that lazy person, So that activity, I think we discount it, but it can be 10 to 15% or more of your daily energy expenditure. It can be significant. And I think that part of the challenge during the pandemic was, we weren't getting out of the house to do any of the movement that we normally would do. Like, you think about what you typically would do, getting out of the house, going to the store, walking to the airport, all the different things that we do to collect steps in your everyday life. So when you look at metabolic rate, it's all of those things together that matter.
That's so well put, and so many different pieces to pull apart there. I think, I looked at like the average basal metabolic rate was about 1 calorie per minute. Now, like, as you say, there's a lot of different variables that go into that. But, just sitting around watching Curb Your Enthusiasm or whatever you particularly like to watch, that would mean if you were going to binge that for 24 hours, which is not necessarily something that I would suggest, but it might be funny. I think, you'd burn somewhere in the 1,500 calorie range. But as you say, there are lots of you have a lot of agency over where that basal metabolic rate is. And
yeah, think if you put a walking treadmill in front of the TV and you were not allowed to watch, like I love really dumb romance novels. I read them a little bit before bed, or spy novels, because it's a way to turn my brain off. Otherwise, help me if I read like a personal development book or a business book, I'll be. So I have to do something to shift myself to go to sleep. So that's what I do. The only other time I'm allowed to read those is if I'm doing in the breaks of HIIT training upstairs. So I will do my HIIT training, and on the break parts, if I'm on like the Stairmaster or the bike, I can read a little bit in between, and then I push it again. Right?
I love it.
But I have to earn it, right?
Yeah.
Just like you have to earn your carbs.
Yeah, you earn your romance novels. So, and then you touched on the thermic effect of food. So I think this is a really a decent bridge into just the nature of protein in general. And protein obviously has a higher thermic effect, as you alluded to. So for every gram that you eat of protein, it's about 4 calories. But
one's gone just in that poof.
But one basically just incinerates through the metabolic processes. I'm not sure if that's sort of the ripping off of the nitrogen or the kind of building up of the. It's just magic, yeah. It's the muscle synthesis or whatever.
Here's the bigger part of this, and I'm always looking at, what can we do to create the biggest win? And if someone's trying to lose weight, I know that I want them to hold on to muscle while they lose fat.
Yeah.
And that means, and as we age, if you're 40 plus, you become what's called anabolic resistance, where it's harder for you to trigger muscle protein synthesis, harder for you to build muscle, both through resistance training and through protein. So we actually need more protein than we used to. Plus, we're starting to eat less. And what I hear so often is, I can't eat that much protein, right? And I really want someone, we have the protein calculator, but somewhere between 0.7 and 1 gram per pound of target body weight. And if you're going to air more, air going overboard, So what I find with people is they'll say, oh, I can't eat that much. I go, well, here's what I want you to do. The biggest way to fail on a weight loss program is to be hungry and have cravings. Wouldn't you agree? Like
100%.
you have hunger, you have cravings, all bets are off. Let's be real. So the cool thing with protein is, not only is it more thermic than fat and carbs, but it's also more satiating and satisfying. And I say both of those because both of those matter. So it's going to help you with hunger, but it's also going to help you with cravings. I did this little 7-day protein challenge where I like to give people one thing and see what happens. And I only thing, eat the right amount of protein for your target body weight. And the biggest thing that came out of that, and I just did a little questionnaire. I just wanted to see what would happen. Biggest thing was, I'm not hungry and I don't have cravings. I know that if they are saying those things, that we can win, right? Yeah. That we've got a long-term win. Plus the research shows that people who eat protein first, I know that if you eat protein first, that we got it in. People will tell me, oh, I can't eat that. I get too full. Well, don't eat the other stuff first then, so that you won't be too full, right? And people who do that tend to eat less. There was a great study that showed people who eat protein first make better food choices overall. Probably because they're satiated and satisfied.
And do you think that's because it shuts down ghrelin, or is it just slow absorbing, or is it slow gastric emptying, or do you have any insight into that?
So it's definitely slowing down stomach emptying. Mm-hmm. It definitely takes longer to digest. It also is a natural GLP-1 agonist. Right. So, you hear about these weight loss drugs and what they do. And I'm always looking at, all right, well, how would we do that naturally? Because it's working with your own body system of creating a GLP-1 agonist working in the gut. Well, exercise does that and protein does that. So cool. Why don't we do those? Let's see how far we can get.
Save ourselves right. Some,
save some cash.
Some cash, some infusion trips, and also have a more enjoyable experience. So I think if I can distill the headline there, it's, we should be aiming for somewhere between 0.7 to 1 gram per pound.
But don't be afraid if you eat more than that. And it's interesting. I have a professor who lives nearby me who has the only physique and performance lab in the country. And he's doing the majority of his research on women because his wife is 50. So now he's doing research on 50-year-old women. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. And you're a neighbor,
That's awesome.
And so he came over to do a podcast and he said, so how much protein do you eat? And I told him, he goes, every time I see a lean woman, and he's been now at this, 20, 25 years. And he says, every single lean woman I see eats, at least a gram per pound of body weight, every single one across the board. It's always that way. And the other thing that we know is that when you do that, you actually are going to make sure that you hold on to that fat-free mass as you lose body weight, so that when you go into a caloric deficit, you won't fall into that problem that you see so often. And gosh, I remember I had a client, another Vicky client, way back when, who she'd so hijacked her metabolism from yo-yo dieting that she got to a point where she'd eat more than 800 to 1,000 calories a day and start to gain weight. And the only way we could get her back to normal, which you can imagine how much she didn't want to do this, I was like, well, we've got to eat. We're going to have to gain some before we lose some here, which is a really popular thing to do with someone who hires you to lose weight. Say, guess what we get to do here? But when you think about it, a really important concept is that you don't lose weight to get healthy. And I credit Dr. Diana Schwartzbein for this. I learned this from her years ago. You actually get healthy to lose weight. And when we say that, you get metabolically healthy to lose weight.
That's right.
And one of the fastest ways to become metabolically healthy is build muscle. And you can't build muscle without optimal protein. If you're, hey, in your 20s, it's amazing what you can get away with, but, not so 30, 40, 50, 60. Like the margin of error is gone. And so you've got to have the protein, and it's got to be high quality protein so that you have because we're eating protein for the amino acids, right?
That's right. So do you get a big bolus of it kind of first thing, or how do you structure the consumption of protein across the day?
Yeah. And there's a lot of literature, both sides on this. So I'm going with what I think makes the most sense based on the current literature and based on what people can do. Because that's the other part that I'm always looking at is if we could design the perfect program that no one can do, then it doesn't matter. The tree fell in the forest, right?
Yeah.
And so let's think about what's happening in your body so that we can make the right decision. So ideally, we are eating based on our, on the circadian rhythm. I think that is very important. We stop eating minimally 2 hours before bed. I think 3 to 4 hours is better. We're getting ready for bed. We're shutting everything down. Our body is like cooling down now. Our pancreas is like, I can relax. I do not have to keep pumping out insulin. This is why, and you'll see it if you're wearing a CGM. You'll see it when you're wearing an Oura ring. If you eat late at night, you will have higher fasting blood sugar because your body couldn't pump out the insulin needed to handle that. And you'll also have a crappy night's sleep. I remember doing this once in my Oura ring because I do not eat late at night. Like, I just don't do it. And I did. And my Oura ring's like, looks like you ate late last night. I'm like, wow, that is so wild. But boy, you want to interfere with your sleep and have higher fasting blood sugar, do that. That's the fast way to do it. So you stop eating, like, let's say you finished dinner at 7, went to bed at 10, woke up around 6 or so, and you gave your body a chance to wake up and gave yourself an hour or two. I think 2 hours is really the sweet spot. And I don't like the long intermittent fasting in the morning because now you've been in a fasted state. You're catabolic. You are in muscle protein. Your body has muscle protein turnover. It's breaking down. It's building up. It's a yin and yang, just like with your bones. And so now you've been in muscle protein breakdown, and you want to give yourself that bolus of protein with enough leucine. And this is the research, since you mentioned Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, this is the research she was in the lab with Dr. Donald Layman, who discovered this leucine trigger. somewhere in the 2.5 to 3 grams. You want to give yourself that protein to hit that, to basically flip the switch into muscle protein synthesis. And you look at what most people eat for breakfast, and they're flipping the switch to like a blood sugar roller coaster,
That's
right?
Yeah.
Or they're skipping breakfast and doing a fasted workout. And this one never made sense to me. And I always like to test everything. I make myself my own guinea pig, but it never made sense to me, this idea of a fasted workout, because when you're doing a high intensity exercise routine, whether it's, high intensity cardio, more of that, or resistance training, your primary fuel source should be glucose. You'll still, you're going to go back and forth between energy systems, but glucose for the win, right? Mm-hmm. So why would fasting wouldn't make sense. And what you really want to make sure when you're going in for a workout is that you can work out as hard as possible. So you have to see how that works for you. Some people do better on a fasted. I found that I could work out 30% harder when I had the right fuel on board than I could if I went in fasted. Yeah. So you want to hit that switch so you start that muscle protein synthesis. Now, I think probably the most important meals are the first and the last, because now the last you want to, kind of not go into muscle protein breakdown for a while, but you do need to you need to build up, break down. You need to take out the cellular trash, right? But I like to divide it throughout the day. And I think, we don't know at this point. There just was a study that came out that said there was no upper limit on protein, except the study was super flawed. I think probably if we think of doing something more in the range, especially for women, of 40 to 60 grams, kind of 30 at the lowest, but it depends on how much leucine's in that. Some things are higher quality than others. I've been using essential amino acids, and I just saw a study that actually proved this. And I was like, cool. Cause I was doing it and I was doing it based on what made sense, but I didn't have a study for it, where I think you can use some essential amino acids along with what you're doing, kind of as an insurance policy, so that just in case you didn't hit the whole 3 grams of leucine, you'll have it from your essential amino acids. But I would say breakfast and dinner for sure. But I think we're better off, getting a bolus of probably a breakfast, lunch, dinner. Now, if you are going to compress your feeding window a little bit, remember, exercise is probably the best way to trigger autophagy. That's one of the reasons we fast. I think that time-restricted eating, we should be time-restricted eating anywhere from the neighborhood of 12 to 15 hours a day. That still allows you 3 meals in. But if you do compress it more, I still think we should be eating early, not late, because that's what our normal circadian rhythm would be, right? It wouldn't be eating at 9 o'clock at night. It would be eating more like, 8 or 9 in the morning and finishing at 4 or 5.
Yeah. This is the interesting Tetris that I've been playing with in my own life, to be honest, is how you balance all of these different things. Right. And so, your normal cortisol wave is going to come up. That's going to trigger glucose from the liver. You're going to have a normal insulin response, but that's going to take a little bit of time. So you're going to wait in the morning to eat. And then you want to have your bolus of protein, right, when maybe 2 hours in. So that might be at 8:30 or whenever you wake up, but let's say 8:30. And then, but if you're also trying to maintain a time restricted window, that means sort of, and obviously not eat too close to bed, you're maybe then turning off your food supply, 5:30, something 5:30, 6 o'clock. That's not always the most social thing to do, but to the degree that you can control your own life, that seems to be kind of this ideal window, is earlier in the day, having the feeding window earlier in the day. Because I know a lot of people, they skip breakfast and they do like 11 to 7 or something like that, which is like a little easier to do probably and more social, but it's probably not 100% optimal in terms of how your body is engineered, right? So, but this is the little play. And then it's this balance between limiting overall caloric intake while also getting enough protein so you're creating a bulwark against muscle atrophy. So
there's some interesting stuff there. Number one, I think it's really important for us to think about diets as tools. And there's fasting, there's time restricted feeding. Then there's like intermittent fasting. To me, fasting would be like, extended fast. Intermittent fasting might be like these every other day fast or one meal a day. I really think one meal a day is problematic, but then it depends what you're doing it for. Like, I think of Dr. Terry Walls, who does every other day fasting, but she's doing it for MS and it keeps everything great, So we have to look at the person and go, what are the goals you're trying to achieve? What is going to be the best? What are the best tools for that? Someone just pinged me and they said, we want to know the best macros ratios. I'm like, well, it totally depends. I think the protein range is pretty absolute, but how much you have in there, you might find you push it even higher than 1 if you're, say, a physique athlete really looking to rip down for a contest. That's different than the normal human, right?
Yeah.
So we have to look at diets as tools. It's really important. If we are looking at recomping, and when we say that, we mean losing body fat, building quality muscle. So most of us, as we age, we start to turn into ribeyes. And so we want to drop both visceral adipose tissue. And this is important, when you look at a DEXA, because you'll look at body fat overall, but where you really need to focus and zone in on is where is the fat when you look at the DEXA, because visceral adipose tissue, that fat around the organs, is the place that is really dangerous. And that's what we really want to be working on. And there are specific strategies that help with that, more than just overall, calorie restriction. But let's say that you want to lose body fat, build muscle. We know to lose body fat, you got to be in caloric restriction. You can burn fat and not lose body fat, right? If you're doing a keto diet and eating more calories than your body needs, you're not going to have to go into body fat stores to do it. You'll just burn the dietary fat that you're eating, which is probably not the goal. That's probably not why they did it, right? So, you still have to have caloric restriction. And I think the research, and again, this is coming out of Bill Campbell's lab, that physique and performance lab director. What he discovered is that doing something called a diet break strategy actually is really good for recomping, where you will do a caloric deficit for 5 days. And in order to really understand how to do a caloric deficit, what you really need to start with is a macro audit, where you use a tracking app, we like Chronometer, and you just track for a week. And boy, if you just track what you're eating for a week, that changes behavior anyway, just that. But what you want to do is track to see how many calories you eat each day to maintain your weight. That's your true indicator of your, your daily metabolic rate, more than anything else, right? Then once you have that, you go, okay, 5 days a week, I'm going to do a 25% caloric restriction. I would argue it's way higher easier that you push your protein up more because you'll be more satiated. And 2 days a week, you're going to eat your normal way. And when you do that, it is easier for you to hold on to and build muscle. Because most of the time, if you're a bodybuilder and you want to build muscle, you'll do what I did at the beginning when I talked about this at the beginning of the show, where I actually increased my calories by a little bit, 100 to 300 calories a day, not a huge amount. But I did that little caloric surplus to put on some muscle, right? That's, if you're really focusing, if you said my number one goal is to build muscle, I would give you a little caloric surplus and just focus on that. But if you said my number one goal is to lose fat and hold on to muscle, then I would do more of a caloric deficit of that. And if it's, if it's both of them, I'd really do that diet break strategy.
Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, so great to be with you. Welcome to the Commune podcast.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're connected in just a constellation of ways, but we've never really had a conversation. So I've been looking forward to this one. So just at a high level, like I was telling you before we jumped on, your philosophy around muscle-centric medicine has been central to my journey, and has really just changed the public conversation around weight loss and body recomposition and the importance of muscle. So we'll have a treatise on muscle today, hopefully, in this conversation. And, while the information that you're bringing to the fore is evergreen, is applicable at any time of year, here we are at the top of the year. And undoubtedly, there are many, many people adopting protocols, connected to resolutions, to undo some of the overindulgences of the holiday season.
No
I
doubt.
know that I'm guilty of plenty of merriment and traveling and maybe eating too much around the edges and having a glass of wine or two. So as people try to fulfill these resolutions in the new year and get into shape, what are some of the most common mistakes that people are making as they're trying to lose weight?
Yeah. I love this question because, quite frankly, there's two major common mistakes. And the first one is actually mental. And then the second one is physical. The first one being
Mhm.
mental is that people think that they are somehow going to be inspired and motivated to begin training or embark on a new way of eating, and that in and of itself will remain consistent. And nothing could be further from the truth. You potentially may never want to go train. I still try to talk myself out of it every day. I'm fully aware that I will be doing this, but the reality is execution must take over. So there is a mental component to the roadblocks or obstacles as we transform our lives and our bodies. And then of course, the second component to potentially mistakes that we make from a wellness standpoint as it relates to skeletal muscle is not training hard enough. And we can discuss the way in which we should train for optimal aging, for longevity, for quality of life, and then under consuming dietary protein, which protein truly is the black sheep of the macronutrient family. And
Mm.
if you cover the mental, understand how to eat, and then train, you're going to do pretty well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think we've generally understood health, at least as it relates to obesity, as a weight issue, right? But you're really reframing that conversation. Can you pull on that thread for a second?
Certainly. And this really goes back to my fellowship. And if I have a moment, I would love to share this story because I think, Jeff, in our careers, all of us, we have an aha moment, whether it's that you wake up with visceral fat or being pre-diabetic or not feeling well, or a provider may interface with a patient that just changes everything. And I was at Washington University doing a combined fellowship. I did a fellowship in geriatric medicine and obesity medicine. During the day, I would see geriatric patients, which could range from individuals that were end of life, that were in nursing homes, that had fallen, that were dealing with dementia or frailty, and early mornings and in the evenings I was running an obesity medicine clinic and or doing obesity medicine research. I fell in love with this one participant, and I think that that's in part one of the reasons why I'm so driven to share this message. And she was a mom of three in her mid 50s, just the best personality. And we all know a woman like that. We'll just call her Betty. And she put herself last. It was all about her kids. It was about her husband. It was about doing for everybody else. And she struggled for the majority of her adult life chasing body fat. Did Jenny Craig, did Weight Watchers, you name it, she did it. She struggled with the same 20 to 30 pounds for decades. And the rub was she did everything that the medical community had told her to do. She ate less, she exercised more, she followed the food guide pyramid. And I imaged her brain, and her brain looked like the beginning of an Alzheimer's brain.
Mm.
And, for me, I was seeing patients in the dementia ward. They have dementia units. And I couldn't help but think that we contributed to this, which we did, because over the course of her chasing this body fat issue, she destroyed skeletal muscle mass. And we
Right.
know that the healthier your skeletal muscle mass is, the better your survivability, the better your cognitive function. The challenges with obesity, which begin in skeletal muscle, really create dysfunction of the brain. And that's exactly what I saw. And I went back to my colleagues and I went back to the literature, and really the recommendations was, again, doing everything that she had been doing. I felt responsible. And I felt that if we have an appropriate question that is being asked, then inevitably we find an answer. And just like Betty and all these other individuals that had been chasing obesity, we've been chasing obesity for the last 50 years. That if, in fact, it was an obesity epidemic and obesity was actually at the root cause, Jeff, you and I talk a lot about root cause medicine, then by simply addressing that, we would have solved the problem. But the reality is we don't have an obesity epidemic. What we truly have is a midlife muscle crisis. And until we switch the conversation to focus on skeletal muscle as the pinnacle of health and wellness, we are going to do what we've always done. We are going to continue to repeat the past.
Amen. I love it. As you were talking about Betty, I couldn't help but self-identify as Barney in this conversation.
Yeah.
Because, I grew up as a chubby kid, and then I had I wouldn't say massive. I had significant weight fluctuations kind of through my adult life. And for me, it was always kind of, that extra 20 pounds of kind of abdominal fat. And I would go, I'd get super resolved, and I'd go on diets that were generally focused on caloric restriction. And I would see some success, quote unquote, from a weight loss perspective over a short period of time. But like many others, I would yo-yo back. I'd put that weight on, and then at that juncture, I would have no muscle mass because I wasn't focusing on, the things that you so articulately outline, protein consumption and resistance training, among other things. So I'm sure this is a phenomenon that you see fairly often.
All the time. I saw it so much that I knew that until we shift this conversation and we create muscle-centric medicine, that people don't have a chance. We are really fighting for the masses. The majority of individuals are either overweight or obese. 50% of the population exercises. Only 24% meets the daily recommendation of both exercise and resistance training, in a week span. The epidemic that we are up against, until we actually can change the narrative, we don't have a shot at. Yeah. And why is the narrative so important? And, you probably have people that are either physicians or providers listening to this and thinking, well, is a narrative important in medicine? And the answer is yes, because a few things happen as humans. Number one, if we repeat something enough, we believe it to be true. And that has happened with obesity. We have repeated over and over and over again that this is the root of our problems. So much so that we haven't stopped to question, is that actually true? Because if you go back and you look at the literature and you look at the data, things like insulin resistance, things like cardiovascular disease, things like Alzheimer's, the things that will actually ultimately kill us begin in skeletal muscle decades earlier. In fact, you can have derangements in metabolic markers, things like insulin or glucose, before you become overweight. You can have issues, and some of the earlier studies were done out of Yale. They saw 18-year-old healthy but sedentary college students have insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, just to frame it up nicely, is the pancreas is an organ that secretes insulin. Insulin is a peptide hormone that moves blood glucose out of the blood into tissues. And it's required for the utilization of glucose, typically. And this problem with insulin resistance, meaning you need more and more insulin to manage your blood sugar, creates all kinds of issues. And when we begin to think, what is the root of these things? It begins in skeletal muscle. Before you have cardiovascular disease, before you have any pathology of metabolic derangement. So if we can focus on skeletal muscle, doing the things required of it, then we can change the trajectory of how we age. And not only that, but if we can appreciate skeletal muscle from a different perspective, not just looking good, but truly all of the health benefits that it outlines. I mean, it's an endocrine organ, meaning when you
Yeah.
contract skeletal muscle, it secretes things. This is wild.
Yeah, that was a huge aha moment or moment of satori for me when I heard you talking about that for the first time. That there are these molecules that are secreted by muscle called myokines, right? The
Yeah,
secretome of
that's right.
muscles as an endocrine organ. Can you talk a little bit about those molecules and some of their
Yes.
impacts?
Yes. And this is wild. There are so first, let's discuss that skeletal muscle is amazing for looking good and looking good naked. Everyone wants that. And it is your metabolic currency, meaning it is the site for glucose disposal, where the carbohydrates that you eat go. It is a site for fatty acid oxidation, which I'm sure we'll talk about. It is a site as an amino acid reservoir. You know, if your older parents or parent stopped training or was bedridden, etc., your body will pull from the amino acid stores which make up muscle. Skeletal muscle is also an endocrine organ, meaning it secretes hormones, it secretes peptides that act systemically, that act locally, that act within this tissue itself. And when you think about skeletal muscle, it secretes myokines. Myo meaning muscle, kine is, again, a peptide. Like there was a big information boom with cytokines, right? We all heard about cytokines and the inflammatory reactions that came from macrophages and the immune system. Skeletal muscle has its own secretory units, and these are myokines. And there are hundreds. The most famous myokine is interleukin 6. Interleukin 6 is secreted in response to exercise, which is so cool. And a lot of the early literature, and really more of the current literature, is based on endurance type exercise. There is some evidence for resistance exercise. Again, it's been around for potentially 20 years or so. That's still really new science. That is still new in understanding skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ. When you think about thyroid or cardiovascular, it's still considered new. So when you exercise, these myokines are released, like interleukin 6, and it actually contributes to how you utilize your substrate. How do you utilize your carbohydrates and fats? People typically thought, which is a change from what we believed. The change is people think, well, you're just utilizing energy when you exercise, which again, you are. But the influence of these myokines actually help leverage the utilization of these fuels. So it's not just the exercise, it's actually what the muscles are secreting. The other thing that myokines do, and interleukin 6 does play a role in this, is it dampens the immune response. When you think about high levels of immunity, we think about things like interleukin 6, TNF alpha, interleukin 10, maybe interleukin 15, etc. These are considered to be inflammatory when they're released from cells of the immune system. However, when the same interleukins are released from muscle, they are then named myokines. And these myokines, while say the interleukin 10 released from muscle is different than the interleukin 10 released from cells of the immune system, what this does is it actually dampens an inflammatory response. It helps us regulate our immune system. Where could that be important? Well, think about a lot of autoimmune conditions, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, whether it's Hashimoto's, you name it. There's again, hundreds of autoimmune diseases, but exercising skeletal muscle plays a role in treatment for this reason, because it modulates our immune responses. And I could go on and on. There's, of course, BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, influences release from skeletal muscle. Also, other interleukins that are released, or other myokines like capsaicin B or irisin, which then impact the brain and stimulate the brain to then release BDNF. I mean, there's so many. But I think the big takeaway is that if you do not exercise and you do not contract skeletal muscle in a meaningful way, you do not secrete these myokines in a significant or meaningful way, which also means it is a voluntary choice because skeletal muscle is the only organ system we have direct control over. I cannot tell you to have your heart rate beat at 62.3 beats per minute, but I can say, please flex your bicep or please extend your index finger. And this becomes very important to understand that skeletal muscle has been so underappreciated and that the influence that it has on our brain, on our inter-organ crosstalk. So we talked about just a handful of things that these myokines do, but they interface with our fat cells, they interface with our liver and our pancreas, you name it, they're interfacing. It's almost like picking up, that game of telephone. It's almost like that. This communication where it is just so, it's like a symphony. It is all related.
Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, I often refer to this era that we're living in as the age of agency as it pertains to medicine, because, there was a half a century at least where essentially we thought that our fates were predominantly determined by our genes. That, okay, we have two presentations of the ApoE4 allele. Oh, we're all going to get dementia, And yeah, there certainly are genes that predispose us to certain kinds of conditions. But for example, with skeletal muscle, like you say, we have agency over whether or not we exercise them or not. And as you're discovering, and other people are discovering, that these have direct correlations to things like cognitive health.
Oh, yeah.
That, for example, like we used to think that our brains were essentially frozen, our neurons stopped, that we couldn't develop neurons after the age of 25, right? And that, we're just essentially, there's a descent for the rest of life in terms of cognitive health. Well, we found out, no, actually, that's not true. You can grow new neural connections and you can grow new neurons. And these proteins like BDNF are a part of that, and that they're actually related to how you move your body. It's just amazing, right?
It's amazing.
It's a fascinating time to be alive and to be on the cusp of this kind of information that really empowers people. This is what I find really about your work, that it's really punctuates your work. I often think about it kind of like the human potential movement, like psychology prior to Maslow and Martin Seligman and all these people is all about like what's fucked up with you. And then these people came along and said, no, let's focus on what your potential is, like what's good about you.
Yeah.
And where, we can step into and fulfill our greatest potential. And I think that's kind of where we are. You're the tip of that spear.
Yeah.
With medicine.
Well, I really appreciate that. It came out of necessity. I really had an aha moment. And, from my perspective, I really was so lucky and am so lucky to have mentors. And I don't know if you know this, but my godmother was the group before Mark Hyman in functional medicine. So I don't know if you know who Liz Lipsky is.
Okay, I didn't know that. No.
But Liz Lipsky was one of the original functional medicine. When they decided that they had to call functional medicine something, they got together a handful of people, and she was one of those individuals.
Amazing.
And from my perspective, I do think that this is a little important because you hear a lot in the media and a lot with the discussions regarding physicians that they're not trained in nutritional sciences and that they're trained in a very algorithmic way. All of that is true. However, there are some physicians that are trained in nutritional sciences. I happen to be one of them. And that training allowed me to think in a different way that was a bit outside the box. So my godmother was Liz Lipsky, is Liz Lipsky. She's a PhD in nutritional sciences. And then I fell into the mentorship and am still mentored by a gentleman named Dr. Donald Layman, who is a world-class protein researcher for the last 2 decades has mentored me and discovered a lot of the nutrition positions, I don't know, or mechanisms. There's many different ways in which you could say it, but some of the nutritional sciences and the ways in which we think about dietary protein, he discovered. And I was so lucky enough and am so lucky enough to be mentored by this individual. And I had done my undergraduate in nutritional sciences, and then, of course, medical school. And then I did some residencies. And then I went back once I completed my last residency to do this fellowship in nutritional sciences and geriatrics. And an interesting thing happens when you have a foundation of understanding. You can master material and then be open to different information.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. And it's
well,
just a very interesting experience.
Well, this is the wonderful thing about science and biology, is that it builds on the shoulders of your predecessors, right? And it's always open to new understandings. At its best, science is really just incredibly humble, and it's always just asking, the question why, and then it has a method associated with it, right? Where you can make a hypothesis and experimentation and certain forms of reasoning and deduction, and you test that, and then you observe and you gather data and you reformulate your hypothesis and you make a conclusion, and then you try to repeat that over and over again to come up with some sort of consensus. And it's amazing, that you've been able to avail yourself of those mentors in your life.
And the only reason that I bring that up is because of the noise in the space. And that is actually the purpose for me bringing that up, because we can all agree that skeletal muscle is important. For the most part, everybody agrees that. Everyone knows that we should be exercising. However, then you have to then flip into the thing that 100% of people do, and that's eat.
Right.
You have to understand that there are particular ways of eating which will benefit skeletal muscle and certainly longevity. And there is so much noise in the space that is the only reason that I think it's important to understand the perspectives of where individuals that are speaking about these things come from. Because again, perspective is everything, right? I'm a trained geriatrician. I've seen people at the end of life. I don't wish that on anybody. I think that for individuals that have experienced that, it is a very challenging thing to witness. But out of that, we can reflect back at what are the things that are important. And ultimately, how do we move the needle? How do we move the needle to allow people to think and understand that skeletal muscle is an organ system that we must care for, that according to the data, individuals think about sarcopenia, which is a decrease in muscle mass and function. Think about that as diseases of aging, as something that we would see in our 60s. It's not. Sarcopenia, which is decrease in muscle mass and function, can begin easily in your 30s, if not before, because of our comprehensively domesticated lifestyle.
Yeah. Certainly, you see it. It seems more prevalent visually in older people. And, clearly as you lose muscle mass and then you risk these, cataclysmic events where people fall and then, they can break a hip or something like that. And then you look at the rates of decline after an event like that, and they're just, they're not good. So there's every reason in the world to care about this. I mean, more specifically for me, and, you touched on it briefly, was the importance of muscle as a glucose sink, or kind of for metabolic function. And I think this is something that I'm trying to trumpet loudly because of the prevalence of metabolic dysfunction in our culture. I've seen different rates. It's like 88% of people are metabolically dysfunctional. I've seen 92% of people, but certainly half the country is diabetic or pre-diabetic. So for me, as I have mentioned on the show and to you before we got going, I was very much in the pre-diabetic range, kind of borderline diabetic in terms of my fasting blood glucose. And I adopted a number of protocols to start to get that under control. Where I saw the biggest and most effective regulation was when I started doing resistance training and changed my diet around developing more skeletal muscle. So can you explain what's going
Yeah.
on there?
First of all, well done. Well
Thank
done.
you.
And I do think that it's important to point out that no matter where you are in your journey, you can always build muscle and become stronger. People will say, oh, in your 70s, you can't. No, you can. You can always improve. And again, skeletal muscle is the site of these challenges with prediabetes, diabetes, because the way an individual can think about skeletal muscle is think about it as a suitcase. You open up a suitcase and you're going on vacation for 4 days, but you pack for 30. Can you imagine trying to pack a suitcase for 4 days, but you decide you're going to bring enough clothes for 30? This is something
I
that
do
I
have
do.
3 daughters, so
Oh,
yes,
so
I
you do
can
this, they do
imagine
this routinely. I was just
it.
thinking,
Yeah.
I kind of do this routinely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Good metaphor, though.
one can imagine that the suitcase can only hold so much. Everything else is either it's just not going to get into that suitcase. It's going to be spilled. It's going to just be everywhere. It's going to be all over the floor. And, the packing job is going to be a mess. This is what happens to skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, this is the site for glucose disposal, the carbohydrates that you eat, the primary site, aside from fruit or fructose, the primary site for disposal is skeletal muscle. Now, if you are not exercising and you are not creating a flux and you are not emptying the proverbial tank of utilizing this energy, the carbohydrates and the foods that you eat have nowhere to go. And ultimately, what happens is you see a rise in blood sugar, you see a rise in insulin, and the quality of the skeletal muscle becomes marbled over time. It looks like a ribeye steak with a bunch of fat marbling rather than a fillet. And again, for simplicity's sake, I'm speaking about the highlights of it, right? There's all kinds of things that happen, but to really understand it from a high level view, there is overconsumption of carbohydrates without utilization and emptying this proverbial suitcase. These carbohydrates have nowhere to go. And ultimately, you begin to develop fat within this tissue, which if you continue down this road, you change the quality of the muscle. It becomes more fibrotic. You might have a deposition of other substrates and things in it versus the muscle, which you need. Why does that matter? You mentioned being pre-diabetic. And when we think about muscle, you have to think about mitochondria, which is the site of oxidation and utilization of substrates, of fuels. There is a ton of mitochondria in skeletal muscle. The way in which you have healthy mitochondria is that you have to have healthy muscle. If you choose to do nothing about your muscle, you decrease the health, capacity, volume of mitochondria. It would make sense that if one cares about good blood sugar regulation, which everybody does, then you have to take care of skeletal muscle. One of the things that we see why a hip break or a hospitalization or being written for bed rest is so catastrophic for people is because it destroys skeletal muscle. So what happens is individuals, even if they don't change anything about how they're eating and they were able to maintain their blood sugar and their insulin and their triglycerides on a particular diet, but all of a sudden rapidly lose skeletal muscle, there is a potential for extreme metabolic changes. Not because of the diet, but because they no longer have the muscle, the healthy skeletal muscle, to be able to function as a metabolic sink. And I think that that's an important perspective because it is about the food, right? We do have to address food, but the quality of skeletal muscle is important. The amount of skeletal muscle is important. And understanding that there is a rapid decrease in skeletal muscle within 7 days of bed rest, whether you are young or old, you could easily lose 2 pounds of skeletal muscle
Wow.
in your legs.
It's like 10%, 12% of your,
I mean, it is
yeah.
extreme.
Yeah.
And what happens is as we age, we go through these catabolic crises. It becomes more difficult. The aging process is not linear. We think it is, but we actually have to plan for potential events. Potential events would be a fall or a sickness. And the more skeletal muscle mass you have as you are younger, the more muscle memory you create, the more capacity, the more storage you create, the healthier your myokine system is. Just the whole
It's
gamut.
interesting. I've never thought about it that way. It's almost like having a savings account.
That's right.
That you kind of just put a little bit away in because there could be an event and, that rainy day where you need to access, in this particular case, like you mentioned, like having an amino acid reservoir. So your body's always generating proteins.
That's right.
Oftentimes we associate that with the development of muscle tissue, but proteins could be transport molecules, hemoglobin, neurotransmitters, enzymes, etc. And your body needs those building blocks, and it needs to get them in some fashion. So to have that savings account there in your muscle seems to be a good hedge.
It's absolutely not an if, it's a when. There is going to be a point in time where you will need it, whether it is an infection, anything that increases the pressure on the body, any kind of, again, infection or what we would call a catabolic state, your body will depend on your skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle makes up 40% of your body tissue. This is the place where you are storing these amino acids, which you beautifully pointed out do so much more than just protein for skeletal muscle. It's the requirement for neurotransmitters, for bone, for hormones, you name it. Any structure, protein is a requirement.
Yeah. So I want to go into some of the best methods to actually build muscle in your protocol. I want to just touch on before we travel over that bridge around some of the kind of more, I guess I'd call them biopsychosocial elements of muscle development. I mean, yes, the aesthetic change can be gratifying. We like to look good and we like to be appreciated for looking good. I think, though, what I also find is that there is a psychological shift that accompanies that just around feelings of confidence that can then punctuate other areas of your life. So maybe you could talk about that just for a second.
This is actually, quite frankly, one of my most favorite topics. I don't know if you know this, but I still see patients and I take care of many people, and those individuals have a few things in common. One, they typically are very entrepreneurial in nature. They are mavericks. They are really in it to change the game. And one of the things that we have to understand is that skeletal muscle is this currency. And it's this currency that's so unique. It can't be bought. It can't be sold. It can't be bargained for. It can't be injected. It cannot be, I mean, I guess it could be injected, but you know what I mean. You're not going to Botox your way to better muscles. It requires you to become a very particular kind of person. It requires you to become a person who can withstand physical and mental discomfort. It requires you to become a person of physical discipline, not just mental discipline. There are many people that are good at business and then leave their bodies as a secondary attribute. Skeletal muscle is not playing. It is something that when you develop a capable body, a body that has capacity, this will translate to everything else in life.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then I think you'll love this one too.